A cutter is typically a small, but in some cases a medium-sized, watercraft designed for speed rather than for capacity. Traditionally, a cutter sailing vessel is a small single-masted boat, fore-and-aft rigged, with 2 or more headsails and often a bowsprit. The cutter's mast may be set farther back than on a sloop. In modern usage, a cutter can be either a small or medium-sized vessel whose occupants exercise official authority. Examples are harbor pilots' cutters and cutters of the U.S. Coast Guard or UK Border Force. Cutters can also be a small boat serving a larger one to ferry passengers or light stores between larger boats and the shore. This type of cutter may be powered by oars, sails or a motor. Sailing. The cutter is one of several types of sailboats. Traditionally, the sloop rig was a rig with a single mast located forward of 70% of the length of the sailplane. In this traditional definition, a sloop could have multiple jibs on a fixed bowsprit. Cutters had a rig with a single mast more centrally located, which could vary from 50% to 70% of the length of the sailplane, with multiple headsails and a running bowsprit. A mast located aft of 50% would be consideed a mast-aft rig. Somewhere in the 1950s and 1960s there was a shift in these definitions such that a sloop only flew one headsail and a cutter had multiple headsails, and mast position became irrelevant. In this modern idiom, a cutter is a sailing vessel with more than one headsail and one mast. Cutters carry a staysail directly in front of the mast, set from the forestay. A traditional vessel would also normally have a bowsprit to carry one or more jibs from its end via jibstay on travelers. In modern vessels, the jib may be set from a permanent stay fixed to the end of a fixed bowsprit, or directly to the stem fitting of the bow itself. In these cases, that may be referred to as the forestay, and the inner one, which will be less permanent in terms of keeping the mast up, may be called the stay. A sloop carries only one headsail, called either the foresail or a jib. The cutter rig, especially a gaff rig version where the sails aft the mast were divided between a mainsail below the gaff and a topsail above, was useful for sailing with small crews as the total sail area was divided into smaller individual sails. These could be managed without the need for large crews, winches, or complex tackles, making the cutter especially suitable for pilot, customs and coast guard duties. For example, a pilot cutter may only have 2 people on board for its outward trip, the pilot to be delivered to a ship and an assistant who had to sail the cutter back to port single-handed. The cutter sailing rig became so ubiquitous for these tasks that the modern-day motorized vessels now engaged in these duties are known as cutters. Rowing. The open cutter carried aboard naval vessels in the 18th century was rowed by pairs of men sitting side by side on benches. The cutter, with its transom, was broader in proportion compared to the longboat, which had finer lines. The watermen of London used similar boats in the 18th century, often decorated as depicted in historical prints and pictures of the River Thames in the 17th and 18th centuries. The modern waterman's cutter is based on drawings of these boats. They are 34 feet long with a beam of 4 feet 6, and they can have up to 6 oarsmen either rowing or sculling, and can carry a cox and passengers. The organizers of the Great River Race developed the modern version in the 1980s, and now many of the fleet of 24 compete annually in this marathon of the river. Waterman's cutters also compete annually in the Port of London Challenge and the Port Admiral's Challenge. Cutter races are also to be found at various town rowing and skiffing regattas. In addition, the cutters perform the role of ceremonial livery barges with the canopies and armorial flags flying on special occasions. Cutters have been used for record-breaking attempts, and crews have achieved record times for sculling the English Channel in 1996 and for sculling non-stop from London to Paris in 1999. Pulling. A pulling cutter was a boat carried by sailing ships for work in fairly sheltered water in which load-carrying capacity was needed, for example in laying a kedge. This operation was the placing of a relatively light anchor at a distance from the ship so as to be able to haul her off in its direction. The oars were double-banked. That is, there were 2 oarsmen on each thwart. In a seaway, the long boat was preferred to the cutter as the finer lines of the stern of the former meant that it was less likely to broach to in a following sea. In the Royal Navy, the cutters were replaced by 25 and 32-foot motor cutters. However, the cutter's traditional work had grown beyond the capacity of a boat as ships became larger. Though primarily a pulling boat, this cutter could also be rigged for sailing. Naval cutter. Cutters were widely used by several navies in the 17th and 18th centuries and were usually the smallest commissioned ships in the fleet. As with cutters in general, they were distinguished by the large fore-aft sailplans with multiple headsails, usually carried on a very long bowsprit, which was sometimes as long as half the length of the boat's hull. The rig gave the cutter excellent maneuverability, and they were much better at sailing to windward than a larger square-rigged ship. Larger naval cutters often had the ability to hoist 2 or 3 square-rigged sails from the mast to improve the downwind sailing performance. As well, navies used cutters for coastal patrol, customs duties, escort, carrying personnel and dispatches, and for small, cutting-out raids. As befitted the size and intended role, naval cutters were lightly armed, often with between 6 and 10 small cannon. In the rating system of the Royal Navy, cutter was the lowest classification, coming below the sloop of war as an unrated vessel. Whilst the classification included true sailing cutters, the rating was given to any ship of suitable size and/or importance. Under the system, a cutter was commanded by a lieutenant who would be the only commissioned officer on board. HMS Bounty was classed as a cutter under the command of Lieutenant William Bligh, despite being a true ship with 3 square-rigged masts. Pilot cutter. The pilot cutter developed from the need for a fast boat to take maritime pilots from harbor to incoming large trading vessels, as most early pilots were local fishermen who undertook both jobs, although licensed by the harbor to operate within the jurisdiction. Pilots were generally self-employed, and the quickest transport meant greater income, as the fishing boats were heavy working boats and filled with fishing equipment. They needed a new type of boat. Early boats were developed from single-masted fishing cutter designs and twin-masted yawls, and latterly into the specialist pilot cutter. The natural dangers of the Bristol Channel brought about over many years the development of the specialist Bristol Channel pilot cutter. According to records from Pill, Somerset, now housed in the Bristol Museum, the first official Bristol Channel pilot was Barge Master George James Ray, appointed by the Corporation of Bristol in May 1497 to pilot John Cabot's Matthew from Bristol Harbour to the open sea beyond. In 1837, pilot George Ray guided Brunel's SS Great Western, and in 1844 William Ray piloted the larger SS Great Britain on her maiden voyage. Customs services. The term cutter is also used for any seaworthy vessel used in the law enforcement duties of Great Britain's border force. The United States Coast Guard are the customs services of other countries. In America, the early revenue cutter service operated customs cutters, which were commonly schooners or brigs. In Britain, they were usually rigged as defined under sailing. The British Board of Customs also used other vessels as hulks, which were moored in places such as tidal creeks. Customs officers worked from the hulks in smaller boats. In the UK, the Border Force currently operates a fleet of 42 meters corvette-type vessels throughout UK territorial waters as border cutters, inspecting vessels for illicit cargoes.